biological sex is a reality. So is gender identity.
I reject this concept. I don't think that a man can be a woman and vice versa.
The brain structures, processes, and activations of trans people are more like their desired affirmed gender identity.
When they say, I'm actually a woman, when it's a man, what traits are those that make them woman-like?
Well, you'd have to ask a trans person.
I can't get them on here. They won't come on to talk.
Yeah.
So you're the best
Yeah.
I can get.
Okay. I am no substitute for interviewing a trans person.
They won't come on.
Always err on the side of including trans people and only exclude them if there's some compelling reason.
But it's up to them to prove to us, rather than me to prove that they shouldn't be in women's spaces.
Let's not generalize about all trans people.
When you say let's not generalize, what are you supposing that I'm generalizing about?
No one tells trans people, you're in the wrong body, you've got to change. That's
Some people-
that's
some
something,
people.
it comes from within.
It's been
It comes from
encouraged.
within.
People have encouraged it.
Who's encouraged it?
Richie Herron was encouraged.
It does not happen. It does not happen.
Well, it did happen to him.
Well, in that case, yes.
My belief is that trans women are men.
Their womanhood is different from the womanhood of biological women.
I don't think they have womanhood.
Well, they have a gender identity that is based on womanhood.
And what are some of the traits of that gender identity?
Gender identity is valid.
Do you consider me a transphobe? When I mention you to other people, to friends of my family, older people, you're a hero of theirs. You were there for, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Iraq, Thatcher, all of these things. These a civil rights hero. Tell me a little bit about the work you've done over the years and the progress that you've helped form.
Well, I first began my human rights campaigning way back in 1967 when I was still at school, age 15. My first big campaign was against the death penalty in my hometown of Melbourne, Australia. I opposed the planned execution of Ronald Ryan, who had allegedly shot dead a prison warder during a jail escape. But having read reports from the trial, I was not convinced that his conviction was safe. There was conflicting evidence. So I joined the campaign, but sadly we lost. He was executed anyway.
Oh.
And that provoked my, sense of injustice and questioning the government, the police, the judiciary, everything I'd taken previously for granted. And then I went on to initiate some of the early campaigns by white Australians in support of Indigenous First Australians, the Aboriginal peoples, also against Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War alongside the United States and the draft for that war. So I became very active from a very early age. Over the last nearly 6 decades, I've been involved in more than 3,000 direct action protests.
Wow.
I've been arrested or detained by the police more than 100 times. I've been subjected to more than 300 violent assaults, mostly by far-right extremists and homophobes, plus more than 50 attacks upon my home, bricks and bottles through the windows, 3 arson attempts, even a bullet through my front door.
Jesus.
But I am still here, and I'm still campaigning. I'm 72 now, and I intend to carry on for another 20 plus years.
Has it hardened you, those experiences?
I guess over time, when you get so many knocks, it is tough, and you have to draw on those reservoirs of resilience. I first began championing against Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War. It was very much a minority point of view. Most people believed the war was just. When I realized I was gay at the age of 17 in 1969, homosexuality in my hometown of Melbourne was still a serious criminal offence.
Wow.
You could be jailed for several years. You could even be forced to undergo compulsory psychiatric treatment in a mental hospital.
Shit.
That's what it was like.
Late on, I didn't realise.
Absolutely.
Was it like that in the UK at the time? No.
Well, in the UK until 1967, the maximum penalty for homosexuality was life imprisonment.
Wow.
Life imprisonment.
I didn't realise. I thought this was all further back. I thought sort of World War II time,
Not at all, not at all.
That's extraordinarily recent.
The full decriminalisation of homosexuality only finally happened in England and Wales in 2003. 2003. In Northern Ireland, not until 2008. And in Scotland, not until 2013.
And that's not just gay marriage. Are you talking? You mean the actual decriminalization?
We're talking about the criminalization of sexual behavior.
That's extraordinary.
Yeah.
That's extraordinary. And you played a part in getting that decriminalized, would you say?
Yeah, when I realized that I was gay, aged 17 in 1969, I thought, I've been championing the rights of Indigenous First Australians, the right of the Vietnamese people to determine their own future without American invasion and occupation. I thought, well, now it's time to campaign for me. And back then, there were no LGBT plus organizations in Melbourne, not even any helplines or switchboards, absolutely nothing. So I tried to set up a gay rights organization, but all my friends were too scared. So all I could do was write letters to the press or to MPs, making the case for decriminalization and against the psychiatric abuse of LGBTs.
Why weren't you scared?
Well, I was scared, but I thought, we have to fight this. Change will only come if we're prepared to stand up.
So you weren't. It was not that you might be on the psychopathy spectrum, and you're like, I don't care. I don't feel fear. You do feel fear.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And initially, I didn't sign my name or give my address because I was afraid the letters might be handed over to the police, and there'd be a knock at the door, and I'd be carried off to prison.
Was it scary realizing you were gay in a place that wasn't allowed?
Absolutely. LGBT plus people had no rights whatsoever. We didn't exist in law except as criminals. And queer bashing was rife. There were no positive LGBT plus role models. No one was out in public life. It was a very lonely, isolated existence. But I was determined to do something about it. And I remember in 1969, I calculated that it would probably take about 50 years to win legal equality in countries like Australia, Britain, and the United States. That was a speculative guesstimate, but it turned out just about right.
That's extraordinary. Well, it's amazing the progress that has been made in your lifetime, in my own lifetime. I'm 35, just in the last 35 years, I'm learning more than I even realized. You fought the sexual apartheid as well. What is the sexual apartheid, and does a form of that still exist?
Oh, yeah, in the 1980s, 1990s, I coined the phrase sexual apartheid to describe the way in which there were separate laws for straight people and for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans people. I wanted to show that, like under the apartheid system in South Africa, which distinguished and made penalties for black people based on their race, similarly, there was a sexual apartheid in modern Britain based on sexual orientation and gender identity. That large aspects of gay male life were still criminalized. It was lawful to sack someone from their job or deny them housing. Discrimination in education and healthcare was the law. We had no rights, no legal recognition. Our love and commitment, our partnerships did not exist in law. So it was a very much a two-track system. If you were straight in an opposite sex relationship, you had rights. If you were gay, lesbian, or bisexual, and you had a same-sex relationship, you didn't have rights. It was a clear differentiation based on sexual orientation.
So I think this is where I wanted to start where you and I obviously agree. And I'm so amazed by the work that you've done. And where we disagree, as you know, is with regards to the trans side of this. Because when we talk about the rights, with dealing with the T, a lot of people believe that we're impinging upon the rights of other people, which is typically women in this case. What do you say to that?
I think there's a lot of confusion. Biological sex is a reality. So is gender identity. They're two different things. And in both cases, people have rights. Biological women, they have rights. Trans women and trans men, they have rights. There shouldn't be a conflict situation. These are two different things, and there's a space for everyone.
So with regards to, these are the obvious ones, but women's prisons, women's changing rooms, women's sports, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, of course, there are circumstances where trans women who have been convicted of violent or sexual offences against women should not be in women's spaces. Absolutely. But that is not representative of the majority of trans people. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny minority.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, when it comes to women's prisons, any trans person with a history of sexual or physical violence against women, they have no place in the women's prison. When it comes to women's sports, I'm not in favor of a blanket ban on trans people. I think there ought to be individual assessment, because trans men and women are not all the same. They come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. I have a friend who plays for a women's football team. She's trans. She's one of the smallest and weakest members on the team. You can't say that she's got an advantage or that she is, outperforming the women players. The cisgender biological women tower over her, or some of them do. So I think individual assessment, not a blanket ban, but individual assessment. Sport has to be fair. So if there is demonstrable evidence that someone has an advantage because they're trans, then of course that wouldn't be right. But in many cases, trans people are not like that. They're just playing sport. And you can say that, all men who've gone through puberty have an advantage because of, puberty. Well, not quite. Most men will have an advantage. But then again, if a trans woman undergoes hormone treatment and lowers levels of testosterone, in many cases, they won't have that advantage. So again, I'm talking about individual assessment. But fairness is paramount. I agree.
My understanding is the vast majority who've gone through puberty will have larger bone structures and things like that will give them that advantage. It's rare to find even a short man who's gone through that, regardless of their gender identity, who isn't significantly stronger than probably all the women on the team. The person you're referring to must be quite exceptionally weak as far as men go.
Well, the rest of the biological women on the team are big, hench women. They're biological women, they're cisgender, but they're big bone, very strong, lots of muscles, compared to this friend of mine who's trans.
It's just so hard to sort of make a policy around this, isn't it? I see what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, individual assessment. Already, when it comes to sport, there is individual assessment. Athletes' testosterone levels and other hormones and chromosomes are tested and checked. Well, let's do that.
So what about...
I also think there needs to be more research because we don't really know what advantages male puberty gives and whether that's lasting if a trans woman, in this case, undergoes hormone treatment and so on. We don't know. And so I'm all in favor of more research. And on the basis of that research, then we can come to a decision.
Yeah. But I presume that before that research is conclusive, we don't start putting biological males in female sports and vice versa until we've got that conclusive evidence.
Well, again, there needs to be individual assessment. If there is clear demonstrable advantage, fair enough. But look, all elite athletes have advantages. Michael Phelps won all those gold medals in swimming. He had huge biological and other advantages over other male competitors. He had an exceptionally large heart and lungs. He had a huge 6'7" arm span. He had huge feet, which are almost like flippers. They were really gigantic feet and hands. And that gave him clear advantages in the pool. But no one's saying that he should be stripped of his medals.
Well, but there's a reason we do split men and women, because of the the strength differences are just so large. And also there is a cultural aspect, isn't there, of sort of men for so many years beating up women.
Yeah.
I think that's what a lot of people saw with the issues. And I know this is also controversial, but with Iman Khalif and there were two boxers, weren't there, who many believe to be men, many believe were women. But if they were men, the fact is they won every single game 5-0, which no one else had done at that Olympics, and absolutely destroyed more experienced boxers. That's the issue people are worried about.
Yeah, and I understand those worries, and I think that they should be taken into account, and people should look at them. But again, I say individual assessment. No blanket bans on trans. We wouldn't have a blanket ban on Muslims or black people or gay people or others. We would make individual assessment.
But there is a blanket ban on men going into women's sports. So I suppose that depends if you think those men are women or men.
Yeah, well, that's the issue to be debated, and to be more than debated, a decision taken based upon evidence. I mean, people often say, well, it's all down to XX or XY chromosomes, and that is a very good marker to distinguish, but it's not the only one, because there will be people who may have, for example, an XY chromosome, a male chromosome, but will have naturally or by hormone treatment women's breasts and hormones and other aspects of femaleness. So often their physical body shape changes. A lot of trans people say that when they undergo hormone therapy and so on, that their physical strength decreases. So again, it's all down to individual assessment. We also need to look at the very important issue of the growing body of evidence, which suggests that the brain structures of trans people are different from non-trans people.
Yeah, I've read that as well.
People say it's just a women are fancy, but I don't think so. There were twin studies in 2013 which showed that where one twin was trans, in non-identical twins, where one twin was trans, only 2.6 of other twins were also trans. But in the case of identical twins, a third of twins were both trans. And that would indicate a genetic component.
The directors of The Matrix, it's twins, aren't they? Are they twins? They're both trans.
I don't know. Yeah. But
Okay.
the other thing is, that there have been more than a dozen studies by universities in Belgium, the Netherlands, and Spain, which show that the brain structures, processes, and activations of trans people are more like their desired affirmed gender identity rather than the gender at which they were assigned at birth biologically. So there is something there, but again, we need more investigation. We need more research.
My understanding was that what I've seen of those was suggesting that there is something in the brain that's different, but it's not something that makes them any more like women. So it's just something that is something different, and we need to figure out what that is. And I often mention exorcism because I lived in Argentina for a long time, and I went and did exorcisms as part of a documentary I was making. And if we look at the sort of women to men, teenage women, which is a slightly different demographic to the kinds of men who often transition, we're looking at a very similar group of people to those who have exorcisms, and also a very similar group of women who have who suffer with anorexia and things like that. So it might be there's something in the brain that leads them to have more likely to be depressed or have depression or struggle with growing up in a very difficult world, that leads them to think they either have a demon inside them, as with exorcism, or what some people call the gendered soul with trans. I don't think that makes it. I think what I struggle with is what is it exactly? And I don't want to sound like that What Is a Woman Matt Walsh guy, if you know who I'm talking about. But what is it? I want to understand from a trans person when they say I'm actually a woman, when it's a man, what traits are those that make them woman-like?
Well, you'd have to ask a trans person,
But you
shouldn't be asking me.
But you're an activist, and you've worked with them for some time. And I can't get them on here; they won't come on to talk. So you're the best I can get.
Okay. Well, I am no substitute for interviewing a trans person.
They won't come on.
Okay, fine. I'm happy to answer the question. Yeah, I think again, it all boils down to we need more research. We need more research, but the evidence so far would suggest that there is something about the brain structures and processes of trans people and a genetic component which predisposes or inclines them to be trans. So it's not simply because they've woken up one day and said, I'm trans. It's not a whim or a fancy. It's something deep-rooted and something that many of them have known and understood for decades from their earliest, memories. So I don't think we should dismiss it in the way that it has often been dismissed by some critics. I think we need to, show kindness, understanding, and a willingness to look at the research and to have more research to establish the facts, to establish the evidence. And on that basis, we can make wise, constructive decisions.
I agree with you that we need more research, but I think we're both men of science. I think yeah, I presume. Are you an atheist? Not that only atheists are men of science, but are you secular?
I'm an atheist, secularist, humanist.
Yes. Okay. So am I, and I'm not. I don't mean to offend religious people because they can be people of science as well. So I'm not suggesting that, but we're both that way inclined. And for me, that old Carl Sagan, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that seems to be what you're saying as well. And yet we have these situations like recently in Australia where Roxy Tickle wanted access to the Giggle women's only app and won. So policies are being changed based on something that you yourself admit we need a lot more research done about.
Mm-hmm.
That's the issue that a lot of us have, and that's why support for trans, I think, has gone down. Not that we should ever have support for individual people going down. I mean, they're people and they're humans and we should appreciate and respect them. But it has gone down over the last few years since people tried to change policies. That's the issue many of us have.
Well, I think, again, there are some policies that needed to change. Others are more open and controversial and subjects of dispute. But the important, core issue is that trans people have human rights, and there have to be really compelling reasons to in any way deny them access or rights alongside everyone else. And in not all cases is there that evidence. So I think we need to, always err on the side of including trans people and only exclude them if there's some compelling reason why they shouldn't be included. And in that case, it is usually only a tiny, unrepresentative sample of trans people who we're talking about. Let's not generalize about all trans people. They're not all the same. They're huge variety, huge range of different trans people.
When you say let's not generalize, what are you supposing that I'm generalizing about?
Well, I'm not saying you, but a lot of trans critics want a blanket ban on all trans people in sport. And I'm saying, no, that's not the right approach. Have individual assessment. So where someone does have, where there's evidence of a demonstrable significant advantage, then perhaps there is a case for excluding them. But we need to do that on a case-by-case basis, as athletic and other sporting bodies already do. They do make individual assessments. They do test people's testosterone, do test their chromosomes. Let's pursue that. Let's do it more in depth, and let's get the right answers.
With regards to women's spaces, then let's look at the Roxy Tickle and Giggle app. Sal Grover being who was sued and lost, and I think is now going to take it to the High Court. I think what I struggle with is I understand what you're saying about we need more research and we need to understand and we need to not ban people from certain things, but it feels a bit like the God argument, which you can't really disprove. And again, I don't mean to offend believers. They are welcome to believe. But if somebody says to me, hey, God created the world, you don't know it, that he didn't, I don't really know what I can say there. And if policies and laws are implemented on the basis of I can't disprove God, I don't have good enough evidence to disprove God, which I will never have, then that's going to affect the country. It's going to affect the place I live in. And it's going to lead to, I think, unfair laws based not on rationality, but on magical thinking and faith, which people are allowed to have. People, I think, also can have faith that in this idea, which I don't believe in, which is that men can have an identity inside them that actually means they are women. I'm not representing it the best I can, but you know what I mean. But it's up to them to prove to us rather than me to prove that they shouldn't be in women's spaces. Do you see what I mean?
I think a lot of people say, well, trans women should not be in women's centers and so on. Well, why not? Only a tiny minority of trans women have ever been a threat to women as a whole. In fact, the biggest threat to biological women are other biological women. They are the ones who, on evidence, seem to be committing the most crimes against women.
What, not men?
No, excluding men. Excluding men in terms of women-on-women violence, it's mostly biological women, not trans women. But leaving that aside, I have a friend who works for a women's centre in the north of England. For 7 years, they have opened up their women's centre to trans women by an agreement, a vote by the staff and by the women users. They have never, ever had a problem. The cisgender biological women there are quite happy for trans women to be there. They've deported themselves with kindness and respect towards other women. There's never been a problem. So again, what I'm saying is there shouldn't be blanket bans. There should be individual assessment. And that women's centre, by the way, vets all women who come to the centre. It doesn't ask about their gender identity or sexuality or whatever to begin with. It vets them, does CRB checks and so on, to provide a safe place for all women, from all women.
Which is sensible.
Yeah.
But so why can't men go into women's spaces? Most men, there's a very, very tiny percentage of men who actually attack women.
Yeah, but I accept the idea of women-only spaces. That there is a good case for, in certain circumstances, to have women-only spaces, and if a trans woman, has no history of physical or sexual violence against women, if they, treat other women with respect, there's no reason to ban them.
Why? So why do we ban men if they've got no history of that?
Well, because women prefer, or some women prefer, to have a woman-only space.
So you would need significant evidence to show that a trans woman is not a man for them to then be in this women's only space, because women prefer to have a women-only space. My belief is that trans women are men who we should sympathize with and try to help and get the right kind of... And okay, I wonder if...
I don't take the view trans woman are women. I take the view trans women are trans women.
Interesting.
They're different, but that difference is valid. They've got a right to be different.
Yes.
And their womanhood is different from the womanhood of biological women.
I don't think they have womanhood.
Well, they have a gender identity that is based on womanhood.
And what are some of the traits of that gender identity? What are the feelings? This is what I want to understand, and no one will answer me.
Yeah. Well, a trans woman feels and identifies as a woman. A trans man feels and identifies as a man. That is their perception. That's their understanding of who they are. And as I said, there appears to be quite a lot of evidence that, there are people born with XY chromosomes, male chromosomes, who have an understanding of themselves as women, and when undergoing treatments, then develop many of the physiological attributes of women. So they're not the same as biological women, but they are women, trans women, and they have a trans identity, and that is perfectly valid. Gender identity is valid. It's not a terrible thing. It's not something fake. It's a genuine feeling, and it's a genuine identity.
I believe that it's a genuine feeling. I still can't understand what it is that makes them a woman, other than they are. It feels like a logical fallacy. It's a cycle of I'm a woman because I'm a woman. There's a God because there's a God. I need something like what traits there are. And if it is, well, I like Barbie and long hair and long nails. That feels like we've gone way backwards. Do you know what I mean? That feels like we're in the 1950s again with this reaction.
Yeah, but most trans women are not like that. That was the older generation of trans women. That's
Roxy
true.
Tickle got long hair, makeup, and nails and things, and wanted to get into Sal Grove. I know that's one person. I understand that, but the Australian court sided in favour with Roxy.
I've known over the years probably close to 100 trans women and probably 30 or 40 trans men. They're not the archetypal or stereotypical reflection of male or female. Mm-hmm. They've developed their own identity, their own unique being. So I don't think that argument stands. It's not about replicating gender stereotypes. It's about replicating a genuine feeling about who they are. And that's valid.
I'm not entirely sure how I feel about the concept of an identity at all, especially one that impacts upon policy, upon politics of a country. What is it? I mean, do you feel strongly that you have an identity? What is your? Do you have one?
We all have identities.
I don't have one. Of
course you do. You're dressing like a man. You're not wearing a woman's clothing. You're dressing in a deliberately male way because you identify as a man.
But this is a social construct, which I know is often what is said from the other side. This is a social construct, and if I grew up in a world where they said, hey, men are supposed to wear bikinis or whatever, I'd pop that on.
Well, but you're not. You're dressing in a typical male way because you identify as a man.
I have a preference.
As I do.
Yeah. So what would have to happen to this identity then? I'm not against the idea, maybe I do have this identity then. What would have to happen to it? How would it be different? Would it just be I like dressing as a woman? I, I, I feel like I'm halfway there, and I want to get to that point.
Well, identity is a very complex thing, and it's multivariate, multi-layered. I'm sure you're not one thing. Your identity is probably multiple. Mine is a male identity, a gay identity, someone from a working class background identity, and so on and so on and so on. I like sports. I like mountain climbing. That's also part of my identity.
So aren't those identities reductive? By suggesting, okay, you're working class, it sort of puts you into that's what your thing is. You're gay, that's what your thing is. And I know a lot of gay people are resisting this. A lot for the sort of Andrew Doyles of this world, for example. I'm sure, I haven't spoken about you to him, but I'm sure admire you so much for the work you've done in helping gay people have dignity, be able to have civil rights, have the same rights as other people who now feel excluded from their own pride, from LGBT and from what was LGB for them.
How are they excluded?
Because they don't see themselves in what pride is. What pride was a dignified struggle for human rights. Now, I went to Pride in Berlin and I was excited to go and found people just giving one another blowjobs in the street. Now, that, from what I understand, I don't mean to tell you how to feel, but a lot of gay friends of mine are really offended by this caricature of what it is to be gay, when for them it is this very solemn civil rights. And yes, you can celebrate, of course, but they don't feel welcome in those kinds of areas. They might have children, they might have families. They don't want to take them to that kind of thing. Do you see what I'm saying?
Well, what you witnessed was extremely untypical and very surprising.
That might be the case. That might be the case.
I've never seen that. I helped organize the first ever London Pride March in 1972. I've been on every single one since. I've never seen any overt sexual behavior. Never once.
Well, that might have been, I was there once and I just happened to see it. It's typical. It was next to me. I get what you're saying. Maybe it's just the German one.
Yeah, maybe.
You know how the Germans can be with their kinks and things.
Yeah.
But
today, thousands of families go to Pride.
That's true.
Straight families.
But that's what concerns people. A lot of families go, and then you do have sort of leather-clad people being carried in chains and things.
Those families are not kicking up a fuss. They love it. They don't see it the way you see it.
But I'm talking about the way the likes of an Andrew Doyle or a James Dreyfus might see it, and that they might be the silent majority.
Well, they're entitled to their point of view, of course, but what they say about Pride is just not true. Even if there had been some exceptional examples during the Prides over the last nearly 60 or 50 plus years, that is not typical what Pride's about.
What some people think is that with any civil rights struggle, you get to a point where you've reached what is as close to parity as you're going to be able to get. There will always be homophobes and racists and all of these things. And at that point, because we want to have purpose, we feel lost unless we continue. And then things start to go a bit awry. And that is what a lot of people think is happening now with regards to Pride, and particularly with trans, that we're trying to shoehorn something in to have another civil rights battle where, in fact, this one is impinging upon women. Do you have any sympathy with that thought?
Well, trans has been around since the beginning of the LGBT plus movement, going right back to the 1890s in Germany. I remember Jan Morris and April Ashley in the 1960s. Trans people, men and women, were part of the Gay Liberation Front in the early 1970s. They were there at the Stonewall Uprising in New York in 1969. The idea that trans is something new is nonsense.
But men having women's rights, that's new.
Well,
relatively.
That's the way you're putting it. I mean, I go back to the early 1970s when the battle cry of the women's liberation movement was biology is not destiny. Now, some feminists seem to be saying biology is destiny.
They've changed.
You're
right. You're right to point that out.
Yeah.
I brought that up with Julie Bindel, and she had to admit they got that wrong initially. But to me, that was another example of a fervent civil rights campaign that, not that feminism had reached parity decades ago, but overreaching with something that wasn't factual. You've said yourself, most men and women are obviously not the same. They can't do the same things. There are biological issues. Just as Julie Bindel may have flip-flopped to one side, so has Judith Butler, I feel. Judith Butler was saying at the start, everything's just a social construct. Well, if it's all a social construct, why can't boys be playing with Barbies? Why can't girls be playing football and being good at maths without being told? And I know they're not all told this, but without a feeling, an ideology that they're in the wrong body.
No one
Well, some people are.
no one tells trans people you're in the wrong body. You've got to change. That's something. It comes from within.
It's been
comes
encouraged.
from within.
People have encouraged it.
Who's encouraged it?
Richie Herron was encouraged. He's an example. Do you know detransitioner Richie Herron?
Yeah. Okay. Detransitioning. That is. I'm very, very sorry for people who've been through gender reassignment and regret it. I'm very, very sorry for them, but they are not representative. A study in this country of over 3,000 trans people found that less than 0.5% had regrets or detransitioned. A Dutch study of nearly 7,000 trans people over a 40-year period also found that less than 0.5% of trans people had regrets. So detransitioning, it's an unrepresentative, atypical thing. For most trans people, transitioning has improved the quality of their physical and mental health. It's led to them to glow, grow, blossom, and bloom, and that's a good thing.
My understanding is that we don't have enough evidence, and that this was one of the issues with the CAS report and WPATH files, was that we weren't following up, and that's why we don't have that evidence. But Richie and several other detransitioners I've spoken with have said when they tried to go back and say they regretted it, they were pushed away. Which was the opposite of how when they first came along and said they were struggling with their mental health, they were very much brought in and said, hey, maybe you want to change and all those things. When they want to change back, it's not so easy.
Okay, well, if they're pushed away, that's wrong. They should have been given the support they requested.
But you can see how ideologically, if you know you're a doctor who's just cut off the genitals of a boy, it's going to be very hard for you to say to yourself, shit, I shouldn't have done that.
Well, no doctor does that without many years of contact with the patient. At the moment, the average waiting time for a first appointment at a gender identity clinic is over 5 years. Over 5 years just to get the first appointment. And then to get follow-up appointments, it takes months and years further. So no one is rushed into transitioning. That's a complete lie. The opposite. It's people who are being delayed and held back and being forced to wait for years and years and years to get a first appointment, let alone hormone treatment and others.
Richie was told that he had to continue, if he wanted to continue with the therapy, which he did because he was in an absolute state at the moment, he had to get the surgery at that point. Otherwise, he wasn't taken seriously enough to continue with.
Okay, but I'm not going to justify individual clinical decisions that I don't know about. But if that happened, that's wrong. No one should be pressured or fast-tracked into puberty blockers, hormone treatment, or gender reassignment. And it does not happen. It does not happen.
Well, it did happen to him.
Well, in that case, yes. There may be a small number of people who experience what you've described. I can't say that neither you and I were present. We don't know the full history. We don't know the processes which he went through. But I feel for him. I'm sorry for him. But that is not typically the way in which gender identity clinics operate. They take a very careful, cautious approach.
What do you say to those who would say that the T is irrelevant to LGB because LGB is about your sexual attraction, whereas T is not?
Well, both LGBT people and trans people are gender nonconformists. We don't follow the traditional expectations assigned to our gender. So we're, in different ways, gender nonconformists. We both experience prejudice, discrimination, and hate crime. And that gives us a common interest in working together because we're challenging the trend, the pressure, the history, the traditions of gender conformity. We're gender nonconformists. Gay men, for example, we don't act according to the way in which men are traditionally supposed to act, and that is to have sex with women and to act in certain other ways. I don't want to get into stereotypes, but I think on the whole, gay and bisexual men tend to be more in touch with their emotions, less macho. There are obviously exceptions, but that is a different way of being a man compared to straight men.
Mm.
So we are gender nonconformists in a similar but different way to trans people.
See, I suppose what I find difficult about that, and that doesn't mean that I'm right, but I think why I oppose it is because I really do like this idea of, okay, let's acknowledge we obviously have physical differences, men and women, but I really like the idea that I feel like quite a feminine man in terms of the classical stereotypes, very in touch with my emotions. I'm quite soft and all these things. And I really like that about myself, and that it doesn't have to be an identity. I see the identity sometimes, not in all cases, being a way of getting attention or replacing a personality with identity. And it feels like a step back. It feels like so I think a lot of gay people might feel like, hey, I'm every bit a man. I'm no less a man. I do adhere to my gender's norms. I just want to have sex with guys and marry potentially guys. I don't want all the rest of this baggage.
Well, that's fine as well. I'm not disputing any of that. If you're happy the way you are, expressing yourself the way you do, that's great. That's what the gay liberation movement fought for 50, 60 years ago. It was about the right of people to be who they truly are, to live their lives and be accepted as equal and full citizens. And within that framework, there's a range for a multiplicity of different, identities, different ways of being a man or being a woman.
I'm curious, when you see people like me, do you see it the same way as one, or you may have seen decades ago and still today, homophobes? Do you see that as I'm somebody who has a bigotry inside me? I'm just curious about that. What is your feeling of people like me and maybe an Andrew Doyle or someone like that?
What do you mean?
Because I reject the idea that of gender identity entirely.
Oh yeah, that's your right. That's your freedom. I defend your right to hold those views.
But if I rejected, I'm just curious about this. It doesn't say anything about anything really. I just want to know if I didn't want gay people to be able to get off with one another, or if I didn't like gay or whatever, I think you'd be within your rights to say, okay, that's your right to have those beliefs, but you're a homophobe.
Yeah.
Do you consider me a transphobe based on what you know so far?
I try and avoid emotional, inflammatory language like TERF or transphobe.
Interesting.
That's not helpful. We need to de-escalate. You may be, I might perhaps call you a trans critic. And I said, I disagree with you, but you're entitled to your point of view, and I'll defend your right to hold that view. I just think we need to get away from this culture war,
sure,
which is not doing women's rights or trans rights any good. If this was a right-wing plot, a conspiracy by the far right to destabilize and undermine the progressive movement, they've succeeded. They've succeeded. It is shocking and appalling that we are fighting each other. I know some really great long-time feminists who I greatly admire and still respect immensely. We disagree on the trans issue, but I'm not going to hate them. I'm not going to not speak to them. I'm not going to denounce them and bully them or abuse them. We just have a different point of view, and we have to have a dialogue.
Would that suggest that there's maybe more space in your mind for this particular civil rights battle being more complex than the gay rights one?
At one level, yes, it is more complex, yeah, and that's not a bad thing. It's not. It's just a reality.
No, I'm fascinated because I don't often get a chance to talk to anyone who's on the other side of this, because they won't talk to me. So, and I appreciate so much that you do come on and talk about this. I've been enlightened already, just as to because that's what we have to do. Can you see my point of view? Do you see?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I totally get. I totally agree. Women's safety is really important. Women's equal rights are really important. Unfair advantage is a really bad thing. I get all that, but I just want a more nuanced approach rather than blanket bans and exclusions.
I suppose where we've disagreed here is, I think we both said there needs to be more research, but I'm saying that research has to happen before the policies are implemented. They've already been implemented, such as in Australia. Because it's an extraordinary claim, isn't it? That a man is actually a woman and can be in a woman's space, an app that is made just for women. Do you, I mean, I don't want to labor that point, but do you know what I mean? Did you think that maybe Roxy Tickle, particularly Roxy Tickle, who seems to have a porn star name, which doesn't do much. I mean, it must be very frustrating for a lot of trans people who just want to live a life. And then you've got this person coming out as a porn star name, which again is going to raise suspicions of autogynephilia, the idea that a man is actually just it's a bit of a fetish. By the way, I think people should be able to have fetishes and kinks and things, but not to get into women's spaces, if you get what I'm saying.
But the tickle issue is untypical. That's not typical of a trans person. All the trans women I know, all the trans men I know, fit in perfectly with, respectively, female company and male company.
I don't disagree, but we set laws for the fringes. The reason that we don't let men into women's toilets is because a very tiny minority of men do violate that space. And that doesn't mean that you and I should be accused of it. We're quite mild-mannered people.
Yeah, but this whole fuss about trans women in women's toilets, it's a mountain out of a molehill. The number of incidents where trans people have done bad things in women's toilets are tiny, almost infinitesimal.
But what do you say
not to justify it, but trans women have been using women's toilets for decades without a problem. The idea that banning trans women is going to protect women is nonsense. A male rapist isn't going to go out and put on a dress and a wig in order to get into a woman's toilet. He's going to just barge in there and do his evil deeds.
Well, in some cases, but there was also Leah Thomas as an example, who's now being accused of deliberately brushing past people with his penis in the women's toilets. Some of the people he was swimming with, the women he was swimming with, are now making that accusation. So there are all kinds...
Well, if it's true, it's wrong. If it's true, it's wrong.
But it was allowed to happen because of the policies.
It shouldn't have been allowed to happen.
So let's walk back the policies.
No, let's make sure that people in those situations deport themselves with appropriate respect for women.
But we live in the real world. That's not going to happen.
Well, those women athletes are going to face men doing bad things every day of their lives.
Absolutely.
Potentially.
Absolutely. That's why they're not allowed in the changing rooms.
Banning trans women isn't going to reduce that wider risk. And again, the vast majority of trans women athletes deport themselves with utmost respect towards women, and they should not be penalized because of the bad behavior of others. We do not demonize and demand restrictions on all Muslim people because a tiny minority of unrepresentative Muslims are terrorists. That is not representative of the Muslim community, and most of us would say absolutely no way should the wider Muslim community be penalized because of the bad behavior of a tiny few.
No.
Now, if you take that view, why not apply the same principles to the trans community?
Well, with your first example, I think you could then say, okay, perhaps there are issues with some aspects of Islam, and we have to police around that. We have had many grooming gang incidents. Of course, a lot of white people do horrible things as well, Christians, Jews, whatever.
But my point was about demonizing the whole Muslim population, saying that the whole Muslim population should be placed under special restrictions because a tiny minority are terrorists. That is not representative of the bulk of the Muslim population. They are not terrorists, and they should not be penalized.
Of course they're not.
Yeah.
But a large percentage of grooming gang incidents do involve British Pakistanis, right? And because police wanted to be progressive, they looked the other way, and that led to atrocities. So,
the police should not look the other way. Absolutely, I totally agree. But that's not the point I'm making. The point is, any decent person in Britain would not accept the generalized demonization of Muslim people and legal restrictions or exclusions on them based upon what a tiny minority might do in terms of acts of terrorism. So I'm saying the same basic principle applies. You don't demonize, or you should not demonize, the whole trans community based on what a tiny minority do.
See, I do demonize, and maybe it's irresponsible, but people in extreme religions. I do, and maybe demonize isn't the right word, but I'm cautious of them. And
But you don't support them being denied, equal rights or inclusion.
No.
You don't want to exclude them from certain spaces, do you?
No, that's true. But I don't give them extra rights that others don't have. And I think with the trans case, we're giving men rights that most men don't have, which is to go into the women's toilets. Now, you and I don't want to go into the women's toilets, but some people do, right? And that's an extra right they're being given, whereas you speak of it as we don't take that right away from them. I'm saying we shouldn't be giving them the right in the first place because it's not their right, it's the right of women. That's where I think we're disagreeing.
Well, I think it's a bit more than that, because what I'm saying is that for 99.999% of trans women, they use women's toilets totally respectfully and politely and discreetly, bearing in mind the feelings of other women using those toilets.
Yeah, but I don't think they should be, because they're not women.
Well, they are trans women. They identify as trans women. They wish to use a woman's toilet.
I need extraordinary evidence for that.
If they went into a men's toilet, there'd be uproar. They could get beaten up. They could get more likely to be assaulted and raped.
Well, we don't know that exactly. And again, I now go on your side here, and I have to say, most men would never do that, right? I would certainly.
Yeah, of course, most men wouldn't do it. But a trans woman going into a male toilet is likely to get abuse.
Do we know they're likely to get abuse?
Potentially get abuse, potentially be more at risk of sexual assault in a male toilet. On top of that, what's really interesting is that the people who make a fuss about trans women going into women's toilets don't make a fuss about trans men going into women's toilets, because that's the logical conclusion. If you accept that trans women must go into male toilets, then you also accept that trans men must go into women's toilets. Imagine how you're going to make women feel when a trans man walks into the toilet. That's not going to be a comfortable situation at all.
I accept that that's a really complex situation, and I don't know how that should be handled necessarily. But the reason that we separate men and women is because women are potentially the victims here, because men are that much stronger, have that much more.
But a rapist isn't going to go into a woman's toilet. They're much more likely to waylay a woman late at night in a lonely alleyway or something.
We don't know. We don't know that.
Well, we do know, because the number of assaults on women in female toilets by trans people is tiny, tiny, tiny.
But it's not just about safety, is it? It's about one of the things that I was saying before was a key aspect of the civil rights movement, which was dignity. It's dignity for women to be able to undress, not in front of the opposite sex, to be able to choose, for example, a nurse or doctor who is of their own sex. These are essential dignities that we give to men or women that are really important to them. So that's what's being eradicated, I feel, by now allowing men to do that. And I accept that if we were to find some sort of, and I know you spoke of the brain, and I agree that there is something going on in the brain of a lot of trans people anyway, that is different, but it doesn't make them a woman. And a lot of women are offended by this idea of if a man is not entirely well, or like something's going on, and I speak of not well because of exorcism, because of anorexia. I guess this is often young women as well who go through these things, that makes them the other sex. A lot of the women I've spoken to who wanted to become men, for example, they later say what it was I just wanted to stop puberty. I didn't want to become a woman at all. And they thought that made them want to be a man. What I'm trying to say is I reject this concept. I don't think that a man can be a woman and vice versa. And I think there's an aspect of social contagion here, and that we're enabling it.
Okay, well, I don't think you're saying you don't think a man can be a woman.
Yes.
What I'm saying is a man can be a trans woman, but not a biological woman.
Right.
That's two different things.
But we make policies based on the sex of men and women, not on the gender. And I don't.
Well, we now make policies based on gender identity as well,
which I think is a mistake, because the reason we separate men and women is because of the physical differences, which is sex. So if there is a gender identity, which I don't believe in, but I'm what do I know? So maybe there is this gender identity. That shouldn't have any and we're getting this sex and gender confused on both sides all the time. I'm always told, no, it's not the sex. No one ever says that, but people do say you can change sex. They're wrong, obviously. But okay, why, if it's not about sex, why are we having things taken off and removed and bodies? That's about your sex, isn't it? It's not what's inside you. And why are we
it's about your gender identity.
So your sex has to correspond.
The whole purpose of puberty blockers, hormone treatment, and gender reassignment surgery is to align a trans person's gender identity with how they feel, or to align their body with how they feel.
But unfortunately, it's not possible. We're not there. We create not a vagina, but what some call, maybe offensively, a wound that constantly has to be dilated to stay open.
Yeah. Well, that's up to trans people. If they want to go through that process, if they feel that makes them who they really believe they are, if that gives them happiness, I'm not going to dispute. I'm not going to say no. I'm not going to dispute it. That's their decision. It's not up to us to tell trans people or trans men how to feel.
No, but we tell people, hey, look, you want to get your leg cut off? And there are those people, I think they're extremely rare, but they want to get their leg cut off. They want their arm cut off. And we do say, well, hang on, that's not right. You need help. We need to talk to you, and we need to see what the underlying issues are here. What is going on? And I'm particularly talking of young girls, but also young boys. Often boys who are gay and whose maybe their parents don't like the idea that it's a gay boy. I mean, that does happen sometimes.
It is so ridiculous to think that someone is fearful of being gay and therefore they opt to be trans.
This happens
to exchange one form of prejudice with an even worse form of prejudice.
But this happens in I believe, Pakistan and India. I've heard of this happening. I've heard of people being told that they have to change their sex to better fit in rather than be gay.
That's a different cultural context, and that is clearly wrong, where family or religion is pressuring people in countries like Pakistan and Iran who are gay to change their gender. That's completely different from the experience of trans people in the West.
But it does mean it's not so ridiculous as to count that out. And some people suggest that happens, that they were gay and they felt, not necessarily because they were told by people you are bad or whatever, but because of a social contagion that made them fear being a gay man or a gay woman. You know, this does, of course,
I go into schools quite often. I meet lots of trans kids, male and female. I often ask them about their experiences. They all say they're so much happier now. They're so much better adjusted. Their teachers say the same thing. The other pupils say they're totally accepted. For young people, they don't really care about these issues.
I got the same answers from people who had exorcisms, the same exact answers from the same demographic of people, children or teenagers, young adults, who got their exorcism and afterwards said, God, I'm so much happier. I'm wonderful now. Everyone was around them, smiling, photos, everything. I finally got rid of what the issue was. We know that teenagers suffer with all kinds of depressions and OCD.
And that is why at the initial stages of gender assessment, it's very important for clinicians to go through other potential factors that may be influencing the young person, to get them to understand their feelings, to get them to understand the consequences of puberty blockers, hormone treatment, and gender reassignment, and to just really nail down that they are very clear about their desire to transition. And that is what happens. That is what happens because, as we know, the waiting time for gender identity clinics is many, many years. And then for further treatment, more years, one after the other. It's no one is being rushed. And there is a proper, there may be some exceptions where it hasn't been followed. But in all the experiences that I know, the person is counseled about other issues in their life to rule those out.
But I know people who had exorcisms and 10 years later still, now they want multiple exorcisms. They want more and more and more. If somebody came to you and said they wanted an exorcism and it would make them feel better, would you necessarily say, hey, go for it?
Well, I would, it wouldn't be my position. That'd be a decision by a clinician. But,
Priest.
And they have to go through a responsible process would be to assess why they want that and to be certain about what the benefits are going to be and what the consequences will be.
But as you said yourself, we need a lot more research before we do drastic operations on people about long-term happiness. And as Cass and WPATH pointed out, this is apparently deliberately not being done.
Well, I wouldn't say it's deliberate. There's quite a bit of research going on. Not enough, but there needs to be more, and I agree with that. But I don't think anybody is, well, the number of people who feel they're being pushed or rushed and not being properly assessed before undergoing transition is very, very small. And that's wrong. Everybody undergoing any kind of major medical intervention should have a very thorough assessment, which includes not just physiological, but also psychological, emotional, and so on. That's what happens in most cases.
Why has the number of trans people shot up? I know, I agree with you that it seemed to have always been trans people to an extent. Why has the number shot up in recent years?
For the same reason that more and more people came out as gay after, the early campaigns to challenge prejudice and discrimination.
But it's been legal to be a trans person for years, and no one was stopping them from getting off with other people or marrying other people.
Hang on. The Gender Reassignment Act or the Gender Recognition Act was in 2004.
Mhm.
That's not that long ago.
Sure, but what I mean is that gay people couldn't come out because they would be arrested, right? They would be and shunned and all of those things.
Yeah.
There was more support for trans people before the policy started to change. People seem pretty okay with it. And I've spoken, totally anecdotal, but to many, many women who say they used to have trans people in their bathrooms all the time and they didn't really mind. As you say, it's for the most part not really an issue. It became an issue when policies were being changed and people saw laws being changed around them that took away rights from women. So I just think, as you say, more research needs to be done, but that has to be done first before.
But going back to the numbers issue, people used to say in the 1980s, or even before the 1970s, gosh, there's a huge explosion of gay people, wherever they all come from. It's a social contagion. It wasn't true then. It's not true with trans people now. Because there's more openness about these issues, because there's more support, more people are realizing that they're trans and are seeking treatment.
But there was more support for trans people 10, 15 years ago than there is now. Support for trans people has significantly gone down as a result of what I'm talking about, but still more and more people are coming out. So the social contagion is still going on.
Yeah, because there's a support network, and there are places, organizations that provide affirmation and support. So although perhaps public opinion may have shifted, although I'm not too sure by how much, I think that's very questionable, still most trans people feel that they're recognizing who they are, and that is why more of them are coming out.
It is possible, of course, and I know you're not saying it's not, that people were wrong about it being a social contagion with regards to gay people, and they might be right about it this time.
Well, that is possible, but it's of the young trans people that I've met, and I've met a lot over the years, they all seem very sure and confident in who they are. They often say they're put through all kinds of quite aggressive counter interrogation. What they described was actually just counseling, but they called it an interrogation.
Sure.
But they were subjected to quite aggressive and quite high pressure to not be trans or to question their trans identity. But that is who they are. And they feel happy and content that they were not always content, but they acknowledged they were challenged, but the challenge did not dissuade them from the fact that they identify as trans.
I think if it's not a social contagion, okay, with gay people, we had a lot of older people, it wasn't just young people, older people who were then finally able to come out the closet, which is a wonderful thing. We don't have so many, unless I'm mistaken, older women. There are a lot of young girls doing this. We don't have many 40 to 70-year-old women going, gosh, finally I can be my authentic self because that's what's inside me. That's one of the reasons I feel like it is a social contagion. Do you see what I'm saying?
Or it could just be that the new younger generation feel there's a space and acceptance where they can be who they believe they are.
But surely now, with all the pride flags all over the place, apart from corporations' Middle Eastern versions of their accounts, but on the Twitter accounts in the UK and the US, all the pride stuff, which, by the way, winds me up. I'm sure it winds you up as well, that they're brave enough to put the pride colours everywhere, except for in places where it's actually needed. But that's a whole other issue. It's a perfect time for women 40 to 70 years old to say, hey, just as the men are doing. And that is why some people think with the men, the older men, a lot of it is to do with autogynephilia. And again, I think there's a space for kinks. I'm not a kink shamer. I'm not some Stasi pornography, whatever. I don't, but that space is not in the Giggle app. That's my issue.
Well, there are more middle-aged and older people coming out as trans. They're not to the same extent or the same profile as younger people, because the controversy is around, how young people are treated with regard to puberty blockers, hormones, and gender reassignment. So it's just that the focus is on younger people, and an understandable concern that young people are vulnerable and they need to be protected from pressure or anything that may push them to be trans when they're not. But that is not the way in which the majority of trans people are and act. Those young people, are clearly very confident in who they are and very affirmative about their gender identity. And I don't think they could be that way if they were being pushed into it or pressured into it, or if it was some kind of social contagion.
I agree with the first two if they were being pushed into it, but if it's a social contagion, I think people can very much get carried away. I mean, we see that in cults, which I think some of the trans aspects are quite cultish, but we see that in Scientology, we see that in Jehovah's Witnesses. These are not people who go into it miserably. They go in.
But why would someone want to join a social contagion knowing that trans people suffer disproportionate levels of prejudice, discrimination, and hate crime? That doesn't make sense.
But you know as well as I do that while that is true on one level, on another level, it does give you prestige points among your peers at school. I mean, there is some level of that. It obviously depends what school and group you're in.
I've never heard any young person say I've got, or imply they've got brownie points or prestige or kudos because they're trans.
But social contagion doesn't only work that way as well. It can also work in a way that, for example, somebody feels they have, like I saw with The Exorcist, they have OCD, they have bulimia, they have all of these problems, and they're hearing about this wonderful miracle cure. Right? That's not everybody's case, but in many people's case, that's what's happening. Oh, I can just stop all this puberty. I can stop becoming an adult. I can change it in a heartbeat. So of course, those people would sign up to it willingly, be extremely excited, as my Exorcist patients were, and only 5-10 years later, come to think, oh gosh, what have I done? Now, I don't believe many of those people would then necessarily come forward and make a complaint and say, oh, look what you've done. It's embarrassing. If that was the case, that's why I don't think it's easy to follow this. And also you could say on the other side that many trans people are suffering with a lot of things and a lot of abuse anyway, so they might not be happy in the future, 10 years down the line, even if becoming trans was the right thing for them. What I'm trying to say is I think it's very difficult to gather data on how well it's doing. But I fundamentally reject the idea of gender identity. I don't think someone can be an insight. I don't know where that, I don't know.
As I said, you're manifesting your own gender identity right now. You're dressing as a man, you're deporting as a man because you identify as a man.
Yeah, but
that's your gender identity.
If I wanted to dress as a woman, then I would just dress as a woman. But I would never go around saying I am a woman.
Yeah, but you're not dressing as a woman. You're dressing as a man because you see yourself as a man. Your gender identity is male.
I'm not that bothered by clothes. I just sort of pop it on because it's expected of me. Do you know what I mean?
You're a gender conformist.
I think in many respects I am, and in others I'm not. As I was saying before, I think I'm certainly not. I never fitted in. I never felt I fitted in with like the blokes, and maybe you can even feel that sitting with me. I don't know. I'd like to think that. I didn't want to be a blokey bloke. And I was tall. I hated being tall because the tall guys in all the movies were the idiots and the short guys were the guys with the master plan. So I didn't want to be this big guy. And I sort of, okay, I'll sort of be stereotypically feminine in that sense. But none of this could ever make me. I want a world where if I did want to wear women's clothes, I wouldn't have to say, but I am a woman.
Absolutely, absolutely. But we're dealing with the here and now. I look at all the trans critics. They manifest their gender identity, even though they deny it. You can see it in the way they dress, talk, move, everything. And that's fine. I'm not complaining, but I just don't like the fact they're denying a gender identity that they clearly have.
There's a difference between exhibiting a gender identity and just adhering to the societal norms that are expected of you. You're a man, you wear these clothes. It doesn't mean I have an identity.
Okay. Well, look, trans men and women, as I said, come in all shapes and sizes, all kinds of personalities. And so on. We can't generalize. There's a range of diversity, just as there is amongst cisgender and biological men and women. There's lots of manifestations. People manifest differently, whatever their sexual orientation, whatever their gender identity. I just don't like the way in which trans people are so problematized, seen as a problem.
But they weren't until they wanted access to women's spaces. That's when that changed. Not to say there weren't the same people who were homophobic, who hated trans people before that, and those people still exist. But when we're talking about the majority of people, I'd like to think, I don't have statistics for this, are very welcoming of trans people, liked all the Moulin Rouge stuff as well, and all of the RuPaul's Drag Race, extremely popular. All of that kind of different gender practicing, experimenting, we were quite into that until laws for women were beginning to become eradicated. And this happened, and I don't want to go conspiratorial, but this really came into play right after the Me Too movement. So it felt for a lot of women like just at this point we were about to reach parity, finally have the same kind of standing as men have. All of a sudden, men are now saying, oh no, but I can be a woman. It's like, well, you don't know what it is to be a woman. You don't have periods. You don't know what it is to give birth. And I know not all women do, but those are fundamental aspects of womanhood that men can't know.
Yeah, but let's look at it this way. Trans women and trans men have all kinds of obstacles to go through in their lives. Obstacles in terms of prejudice, discrimination, hate crime, ostracism, rejection. No one's going to choose that freely.
No.
They're not going to sit down and say, I want to be trans, knowing all these negative things.
Well, no one chooses to be anorexic.
Yeah. Well, they've made that decision based on some deep-seated feeling, which does seem to be linked to genetics, based on the twin studies, and on also brain structures based on those university studies. That's the way it appears to be. I don't think we should be in the business of creating further pressures on trans men and women if you can avoid it. Now, there is an issue about women's only spaces, and I agree. But again, I've said, there is an instance or an example or occasion when it may be right to exclude a trans person if they've had a history of physical or sexual violence against women. Totally agree with that. But otherwise, I think it should always be on an individual assessment. Blanket discrimination is not a good thing.
How much space? No, but it's not discrimination. I don't think it is discrimination because, as I don't want to go in circles, of course, but I don't believe it's discrimination because I don't believe they have those rights or should have had those rights in the first place. I don't have a right to enter a woman's space. That is not discrimination. A man who says that he is a woman or believes he is a woman, I don't believe that these are people who are malicious, mostly who are saying, I'm going to pretend I'm a woman. They believe they are women, just as anorexic people believe that they are overweight and they're not. And they need us to stop enabling these, what I consider are delusions. And I know that's a really...
But you just said that they had genuine feelings.
What's that? They have genuine feelings.
Yeah.
But feelings, I don't want to sound like Ben Shapiro, but are not facts. They feel that they are women. Yeah. That's what I mean. They're not lying to us, but I think they are deluded.
Yeah.
And I think they need the adults in the room. And I know this is a problem because this is so similar to what was said to gay people. That is a huge problem. And I wonder how much space there is in your mind to consider that because this sounds so similar to what was happening wrongly to gay people, that it's maybe made you go this way with trans and that you might be wrong about it.
No, I think that they are different, but there are lots of parallels with the negatives heaped upon gay people and the negatives heaped upon trans people today. And, I just wish that people would pay more respect and understanding for the plight of trans people and not go down the road of blanket exclusions, go down the road of individual assessment. That's the better way to go. And of course, as I said, we need more research, undoubtedly.
How much space is there in your mind to the idea that there isn't such a thing, that you might be wrong about this?
Well, on the basis of all the evidence I've seen, I believe that there are fundamental differences between, for example, biological woman and trans woman, to use those phrases, and that trans woman's feelings are genuine. And it's not just a feeling, it's a whole identity which governs their thinking and behavior. And that is their right. In a free, liberal, open society, people have a right to be different.
Without going into other people's spaces, I think. That's where we disagree, isn't it?
Yeah.
And we won't...
Well, as I said, individual assessment. I'm not saying that no trans person should ever be excluded. What I'm saying is individual assessment. So, as I said, those trans women who have a history of physical or sexual violence against women have no space, have no place in any woman's space. But the vast majority of trans women treat other women with incredible respect.
I agree.
They fit in. Most people don't even know they're trans because they pass so well.
I agree.
They're not a threat to women in any way.
Although I'm concerned for both sides about the passing thing, because on both sides you have some people on the sort of trans rights activist side saying with regards to passing, but look, she looks like a woman. Something about Miriam, that old TV show. Miriam killed her or himself, but they were all going for the Bachelor kind of reality show because Miriam passed. And to me, that's irrelevant. It's not about passing. And then on my side of this, the gender realists or the gender critics, as you say, they will put up photos of people who don't pass and mock them. And I think that's very cruel and unnecessary. And it's irrelevant because it doesn't matter if they look right or not. The fact is, these are, in my opinion, these are not women, essentially. And they shouldn't be given those extra rights that other men don't have to go into. Where you see discrimination against them in a ban, I'm saying they've been given extra rights they shouldn't have had in the first place.
Well, but your option is that trans women should have to go into men's toilets and therefore put themselves at risk. I don't agree with that.
It seems like we're in a really complex situation where either the women will have to feel at risk or the trans women, who is a much smaller percentage, will have to feel at risk.
But most women in women's toilets don't feel at risk because trans people have been going into women's toilets for decades without a problem.
But many do.
And the big danger is, as I said, if you take this rule that it's all down to biological sex, to chromosomes, that trans men are going to go into women's toilets, just imagine how threatened women are going to feel if you pursue that policy, which is the logical conclusion of what you're saying.
Say that again.
The logical conclusion of what you're saying, if biological sex must govern who has access to what spaces, it means that trans women, it means that trans men must use women's toilets, and that will put women using those toilets in great fear and anxiety and distress.
Yeah, I don't know what the answer to the trans man question is. I think that's a really interesting one that you bring up, but it doesn't change. I mean, I think in both cases, the fact is that women, I mean, part of the reason that a lot of young women go through the trans issue, I mean, a lot of women I've spoken to anyway, they go through it in the first place, is because they are so tired of being ogled by men and sexualized by men. So either way, they do not want men in their toilets. Most of them don't believe, at least as far as I know, in gender identity as a separate thing from sex. As far as I know, you'll know the history better than I will, but gender was simply a synonym for sex for people who were too prudish to use the word sex. It was also used in language, German, French, whatever. And it was only since John Money, who obviously, and I don't mean to use him as a card of, oh, so therefore everybody's horrible in experiments on children, but he was one example, of course. And that's where gender identity started to be used as a separate thing. So I simply don't believe in it. I reject the...
Hang on, gender identity was being used way back in the 1890s, if not before.
Right, go on.
Yeah, Magnus Hirschfeld at the Institute of Sexual Science in Berlin, his work in the 1890s was a lot about trans people and gender identity. And, he was a great pioneer, and he helped many, many trans people, mostly trans women, fulfill their dreams of gender reassignment. And he saw a close correlation between the LGB campaign and the trans campaign, in the question that both were, both sides were gender nonconformists.
Interesting. I wish it had gone. I wish they were done as separate things, because I see what you're saying, that they're two gender nonconformists. But really, to me and to people I've spoken to anyway, the LGB issue was about civil rights, to be able to have the same rights as everyone else. The T seems to be asking for a right in a very special circumstance that others don't have. Another man doesn't have the right to go into women's spaces, so that's a separate issu to me. But I see what you're saying.
I just draw you back to Simone de Beauvoir. A woman is not born, she is made. that's the trans story.
Yeah, but wasn't she a bit nuts? Was she nuts?
No, she had said a lot of great things.
Who was she married to?
Jean-Paul. Well, she had a relationship with Jean-Paul Sartre, but
that's right.
Right. But her book Second Sex was an absolute pioneer in terms of feminism.
A woman's not born, a woman's made. That's the Judith Butler Sex as a Social Construct.
Yeah.
But didn't we just say that the Julie Bindel thing, which was that, also there's now, we know that's not true. A woman isn't made. There's been the 300,000 years of women being born through evolution, made through evolution in many generations to be very different to men.
Well, a woman is born biological, but in terms of becoming a woman in terms of identity and role in life. That's something a woman makes, or is in many cases, sadly, made for her by men.
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely
so,
true.
but that does have a segue into trans. You know, they would say, you know, they're born one thing, but they make themselves something different. I think we have to acknowledge that, you know, well, we do acknowledge, of course, that it's a complex issue, and there are no cut and dried answers, and certainly no place, in my view, for generalizations. We have to go down to individual assessment.
Yeah, starting with not already making the laws. That's the only, and I'm going in circles, but that issue with Roxy Tickle, okay, that's an individual situation that's gone wrong because of a general law.
Okay, well, take an example of my friend who works in the Women's Centre on the north of England. The policy is there. You know, they've done the assessment of every woman that comes through the door, trans or not trans, and that's the basis on which they accept clients.
Sure, yeah. But what do you say now to Australia? What do you say to Sal Grover, who just wanted a women's app and doesn't believe in gender identity? And Roxy Tickle is not a serious, you know, there are serious people. I don't know Roxy Tickle, so it's not fair for me to make that assertion, but it does seem like a porn star name.
Oh, no one should be compelled to date or have sex with anyone who they're not attracted to. Yeah. You know, that's a personal choice. If you don't want to have sex or find XYZ attractive, no one should compel you.
It's not a sex app necessarily. It's like a women's app, so they just want to have a safe space. It's not a lesbian app. It's an app to, you know, I don't know what they talk about. I'm a bloke, but periods. I don't know. They're having a chat about periods, and then Roxy Tickle walks in, potentially someone who does get a kick out of it. It's the last thing they want. Yeah. And I know that you agree, probably. We don't know enough about it. Someone like Roxy Tickle, if he is what I'm suggesting, probably shouldn't be in that group. And that's an individual case. But that was allowed because of what we've done with a general law. So maybe I agree with you. I don't know. I'd have to get to that point of individual case, but let's not make the blanket law of allowing men into women's spaces first. Can't we make it no men go into women's spaces, but let's consider some trans people, and certainly not Roxy Tickle?
Well, in a sense, that's what the Women's Centre on the north of England has done. It's decided that, you know, their policy is we're open to women. We agree by a vote of the staff and the users that this is okay, and we will assess each woman, trans or not trans, who comes through the door. And we will take a decision not to allow any woman who has a history of sexual or physical violence against other women. And that applies to both trans women and to non-trans women.
I've got one more question for you, but first, where can people go and find your work, sign up to your stuff and everything?
Well, I am the director of the human rights organization, the Peter Tatchell Foundation. The website is www.petertatchellfoundation.org. If you go to the top right-hand corner, there's a little button which says Join Us. If you give us your email address, we will send you a weekly bulletin on a range of LGBT plus and other human rights issues. It's totally free. There's no charge. So sign up if you wish to. You can unsubscribe at any time. And my foundation does a combination of work here in the UK, about 50% on LGBT issues and about 50% on other human rights issues. But we also do a lot supporting democracy and human rights campaigners in other countries like Russia, Ukraine, Syria, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Uganda, West Papua, and Pakistan.
Really important work. Yeah. Who's a heretic you admire?
I'd have to say Peter Singer. He is one of the great pioneers of animal rights and animal liberation. He's extended our moral horizons beyond our own species to include an understanding of the moral duties we have towards other species that are living, thinking, feeling creatures. So very much an understanding that we have a duty to not harm other species and to reduce our exploitation of those species, whether it be for food or in medical laboratories or circuses or zoos.
Have you ever spoken at Vegan Campout Festival?
No, I haven't, but I've spoken at quite a few other animal aid, and
Because I spoke there recently, and
Yeah.
I bet they'd like to have you. I know the guy now, so if you ever wanted to, I'll speak to him because yeah. Well,
yeah. But I think he's amazing, and he got a lot of stick for taking his stand. But I think morally and ethically, he's got a really important contribution to ethics and morals. And, I suppose it's a continuation. Jeremy Bentham was saying this hundreds of years ago. But, Peter Singer, I think, has really made that understanding much more popular and better understood.
That's an interesting one, and I get right behind that. It's a big thing for me as well. People, please do go to Peter's foundation. I'll put a link just down below. Keep on watching, hit the like, watch the stuff. And I've got one more question for Peter on andrewgoldheretics.com from one of you guys. So get over to there, andrewgoldheretics.com, and we'll see you there for one more question.